Very good. All righty. So we read the scripture from Deuteronomy. We read Psalm 35. And we laid the foundation for why we're doing what we're doing today. Usually our church services are about worshiping the Lord. They are about God's wonderful plan of salvation. And by the way, America has been about that for our history. America has sent out more missionaries in our history than any other nation preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so many matters relating to the preaching of the gospel have been rooted in America. But today our focus is going to be on how our country was founded for the reasons that we talked about earlier. What you're looking at, obviously the background is a picture of the representation of the Declaration of Independence. In the front on the left is a picture of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. That's where these meetings, and you're going to see some videos here, these meetings took place inside there, and on the right is a picture of the room. And you can actually go and visit Independence Hall, and I don't think they let you in the room, but my memory is that we looked in and saw that room there depicted on the right. So the room on the right is inside the building on the left. I should say this up front, that the videos that you're going to see come from an HBO series entitled John Adams. And I'd be very careful about watching all those episodes. They're not, they include some stuff they shouldn't as far as depicting. It's crude is what I'm saying. So examine them before you just recommend them to your kids for sure. But this is the second episode, and this is the only one I've watched repeatedly. The others I've all seen once. This one I've seen a couple dozen times. And you're going to see excerpts from that video today. And I will say, as somebody who is a student of history and try to watch historical things depicted, I have never seen any historical depiction that strives to hold to the facts of history more diligently than this one does. They don't take liberties. You have to fill in a few cracks of you're not sure what they said behind closed doors. But as far as the essence of history, the facts of history, it seems they really labored to get this one accurate. So, with all that said, for the 8th year in a row, we're celebrating our nation's birthday with Faith and Freedom Sunday, remembering the precious gift that we have been given. We're going to go all the way back to 1607, which was the first English settlement in America. This is the one with John Smith and Pocahontas, and unfortunately that turned out to be a failure in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. And understand that this attempt at settling America was a commerce-driven or a money-driven endeavor. Then, of course, we all know that in 1620, a Christian congregation came from England and landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, seeking freedom of worship for themselves and for their families. There were other European settlements in North America before Plymouth, before Jamestown. I believe the settlement in New York City was a Dutch settlement, and I know it predated Plymouth. I think it also predated Jamestown. But these were all people looking for fortune. People coming to the New World to make money. They saw an excellent opportunity to make money. The Pilgrims in Plymouth did not come to make money. They came to be able to, and check out the historical documents. They are abundant. They are indisputable. They came so they had a place to teach their children to worship the Lord according to their conscience. And they had to find a way to make money. The other people, many of them worship the Lord. People in Jamestown worship the Lord, but they didn't come here to have freedom to worship the Lord. They were okay with the worship back in England. They were Church of England people. They were fine with that. The Pilgrims said, no, we're going to follow our conscience. That's going to take us to a place and we'll carve out a living. That's the difference between, can I say this nicely? The difference between Plymouth and Jamestown is the difference today in Christians who live for Jesus and make him the big priority, the number one priority in their life, and Christians who they're all about just being successful, enjoying life, and fitting in with the world. And oh, by the way, we go to church sometimes and we read our Bible sometimes. That's the difference between Plymouth and Jamestown. So, the settlement in Plymouth, their settlement, is a success because their settlement is a faith-driven endeavor. In 1624, the very first colony is officially formed, and it's named Virginia. In 1630, Massachusetts established a new separate colony. In 1632, Maryland established a new separate colony. Connecticut in 1636. Rhode Island in 1636. New York in 1664. Delaware established a new separate colony in 1664. Pennsylvania in 1681. New Jersey in 1702. North Carolina in 1729. South Carolina in 1729. New Hampshire in 1741. And Georgia in 1752. Why am I going through all these? Because I want you to understand this was not a big tract of land divided up into 13 pieces. These were settlements of people who petitioned the King of England for permission to establish a separate colony. And they, for the most part, had nothing to do with one another. They were territorial. They were proud to be from North Carolina. They were proud to be living in the colony of New York or the colony of New Hampshire. And they may have had trade with other colonies, but they were not a body in any way. They were independent colonies that were all directly connected to England. Then in the 1730s and 40s, something happened that was, for the first time, something that affected all of the colonies. They were each and all greatly impacted by a spiritual revival that we call the Great Awakening. It was a movement of God that swept across all 13 colonies, led by men of God like George Whitefield, pictured on the left, Jonathan Edwards, pictured in the middle, Samuel Davies, pictured on the right, who was more in the south. This was the first event, significant event, that impacted all 13 colonies. Something, it woke people up spiritually, and it gave the people courage and the vision to follow the Lord in one of the greatest exploits in human history. Now, something else that continued that revival even through the Revolution that you need to be aware of is that in 1745, a 39-year-old man got saved. He lived in Tolland, Connecticut, which is just east of Hartford. His name was Shubal Stearns. And in 1755, God called him to move to the south, and he settled in Sandy Creek, North Carolina. And his church grew from 16 people to 600 people in a year. And in the next 15 years, 120-something men were called to preach. And I believe it was 42 churches were started. And over the course of the next 65 years, so that takes us to 1820, over 1,000 churches were planted in the South from his church. And they call that the South's Great Awakening. So that was still going on during the Revolution. I'm saying the revolution happened during an extended period of revival in the 13 colonies. But in the 1750s, people in the colonies were thinking and talking about principles of freedom. Ideas that were considered treasonous against King George III, who was the tyrannical king of England. For example, in Boston, Pastor Jonathan Mayhew, pastor of the Old West Church, that's what that church looks like today, preached a sermon. I mean, if you think, you shouldn't think this, but if you think that this is political this morning, this was the name of the Pastor Mayhew's sermon in the Old West Church in the 1750s, no taxation without representation. That might be a little bit political. A Boston businessman in the 1750s named Samuel Adams had gotten saved under the preaching of George Whitefield. He started a secret club with some of his friends to promote the cause of liberty in Boston. Also in the 1750s, a French lawyer named Montesquieu, on the left there, he had recently written a book called The Spirit of the Laws, in which he advanced the idea of separation of powers in government. That's a new concept. All right, if you know the answer to this, shout it out. How many branches of government are there in America? Three. That's right. That is separation of powers, okay? That means that you don't have one guy making the laws and also enforcing the laws and carrying out the punishment. That would be corruption. But that's pretty much all the world knew before that. So Montesquieu's book, The Spirit of the Laws, was advancing the idea, no, you have one group that makes the laws. You have another group that carries out the laws. Then you have another group that rules on the carrying out of the laws. Separation of powers. And so in 1750, a lawyer, if you could go back one slide, I'm sorry, a lawyer named James Otis, that's the guy on the right. James Otis should be as well known as a founding father as John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. Do you know why he's not? Because he had a hot temper. His hot temper ruined his influence in the founding of America. But he was a lawyer in Boston. He read the book, The Spirit of the Laws, and he began pushing the idea of separation of powers. In the 1760s, the desire for a free nation kept on growing. A group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, that's Samuel Adams' group, began meeting at the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston under the leadership of Samuel Adams to discuss what actions they could take to advance the cause of liberty in their colony. In 1761, that same attorney, James Otis, represented a lawsuit against King George III over illegal warrants, which allowed the British government to search your home whenever they wanted to. On the final day of that court case, a young lawyer named John Adams, on the right, sat in the courtroom and heard James Otis present a concept he had never heard before. James Otis said in that court case that every man has a God-given right to life, liberty, and property. A God-given right. That day, the 25-year-old John Adams changed his view of King George, and he began to become consumed with the concept of liberty. Also in the 1760s, down in the colony of Virginia, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, in the Virginia House of Burgesses, that was their colony's law, a place of law, Patrick Henry, 29 years old, who was saved during the Great Awakening under the preaching of Samuel Davies, he was accused of treason for simply publicly criticizing the king's oppressive taxation. By 1765, there were groups of men Thank you very much. By 1765, there were groups of men in every colony. Every colony had a group called the Sons of Liberty by 1765. On August 25th, 1765, our buddy Pastor Jonathan Mayhew preached another sermon, a sermon in his church in Boston entitled, "Brethren, ye have been called unto liberty." Some might say that was a twisting of the text there, but the next night, all night long, a group of people gathered outside the British governor's house chanting, "Liberty and property, liberty and property." Do you understand? The reason they were chanting this is because they didn't have those freedoms. By the late 1760s, British troops were aggressively occupying Boston. Why? Because the people were getting too riled up about their liberty, about justice. On March 5th, 1770, British troops fired on civilians in Boston, killing 5 men, injuring 6 others. Samuel Adams named the incident the Boston Massacre. And he used it to get people riled up against King George in any way he possibly could. As each year passed, oppression and aggression increased in every colony. And every appeal to the king was met with more arrogance, higher taxes, more regulations, more oppression. It was basically, we got our soldiers there. What are they going to do? What can they do about it? Finally, the leaders in every colony decided that they must meet to decide what action to take. On September 5th, 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. That's Carpenter's Hall. That's where they met the first time. And that's the one I referred to when we read the scripture. The Congress began with a prayer meeting led by a local pastor named Jacob Duché. Pastor Duché read Psalm 35. Then he led the delegates in prayer. After he prayed, the delegates had a prayer meeting that, according to John Adams in his letter to his wife, lasted for hours. Representatives from 12 of the colonies attended. Only Georgia was not present. Moderate men like John Dickinson from Pennsylvania and John Jay from New York argued that the colonies should find ways to pressure Parliament to treating them better. That was their solution. But the men known as radicals, like Patrick Henry, left to right, Patrick Henry, Roger Sherman, after whom Sherman, Connecticut is named, and who lived, that used to be called New Milford. And the second man from the left, Roger Sherman, was the only man to sign the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And one other document that slips my mind. He signed them all, and he's one of the founding fathers. John Adams, third man from the left, and Samuel Adams. They said their job was to develop a decisive statement of the colonists' rights and liberties. It was at the First Continental Congress that Patrick Henry stated the distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. This was a new concept. One that not everybody in the room wanted to hear. But one that began to turn the thinking of people in America. And let me say, in case I forget to say it later, that independence and revolution was not the majority view in the colonies. A lot of people just wanted to be left alone. But these men, they drove the concept of liberty and independence. At the close of the First Continental Congress, letters were sent to Quebec, St. John's Island, Nova Scotia, Georgia, because they didn't show up, West Florida, and East Florida, inviting them to participate in the next Congress. So, do you understand? that parts of Canada would have been in on Independence Day, could have been part of America. Their loss. Florida could have been one of the original 14. Their loss. Then the following April, everything changed. On April 19, 1775, on Lexington Green in Massachusetts, the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired. That's called the shot heard round the world. War had now officially begun. As colonists fought the British Army in Massachusetts, a Second Continental Congress began on May 10th, 1775, to manage the war and to decide what course to take. From the beginning, the delegates of Massachusetts pushed hardest for war and independence. Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island were in their corner. But they faced the greatest opposition from Pennsylvania, New York, and South Carolina. Over the next year, one by one, Massachusetts won over the other colonies to their point of view. And it was while this Congress was in session that the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought. Colonists against the British, June 17th, 1775. And after that battle, Congress knew that if they were going to continue, their army must have a leader. presidents of the United States. Also, I want to point out, I'm not sure where he stands in other videos, but the old man with the long hair, of course, is Benjamin Franklin. And clearly there's men in the room that have harsh disagreements with one another. Most of the time, Benjamin Franklin stayed silent. But when he spoke, everybody else stood down. He was respected. He was the oldest man in the room, I believe, and he was certainly the most respected man in the room. Then, so that's roughly a year before they voted for independence. And clearly there's men in the room that want nothing to do with independence. They want nothing to do with war. And so they all have to be won over. In October 1775, King George III issued a proclamation that sobered every member of the Continental Congress. The king declared that everyone involved in the rebellion of the colonies was considered a traitor to the crown. And unless they returned their loyalty to Great Britain immediately, they were to be arrested and hanged immediately. I want you to notice as this video begins, they're in the middle of just routine stuff, boring stuff, tedious stuff, talking about. And while the talking is going on, John Hancock, the president of the Congress, gets a message. And the messenger says, "This is from the King of England." And you can see the look on John Hancock's face like, uh-oh. And he reads the message, and everybody in the room is sobered. The delegates of the 13 colonies took this news very seriously. Months later, June 7th, 1776, in the Second Continental Congress, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, pictured there, officially proposed that the colonies, so in other words, he made a motion on the floor, proposed that the colonies break with England. The Congress voted to postpone a vote on the matter until July. In the meantime, a committee of 5 men was appointed to draw up a document that would declare independence. Thomas Jefferson, left to right, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Thomas Jefferson was a quiet man, but a brilliant man and an excellent writer. I tell you, sit down and read the Declaration and ponder what every phrase means. This man was brilliant. And he was in his 30s, I believe, when he wrote it. An excellent writer. So he did most of the writing of the document. When the Congress reconvened on July 1st, 1776, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who had been a leader of the cause, was opposed to independence at that moment and opposed to the war. Pennsylvania was a Quaker colony. John Dickinson was a Quaker. Quakers didn't believe in war. But he gave a speech making a strong argument against us. So this is 247 years ago, yesterday. Gave a speech making a strong argument against independence. When he finished, many members of Congress tapped their walking sticks on the floor, which meant they were in agreement with Dickinson's speech. And then John Adams stood 1776, Congress would vote on whether to form a nation independent of Great Britain. The outcome of that vote was far from certain. In fact, for several reasons, it didn't seem like it could possibly pass. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina had stated on the floor that South Carolina would never vote for independence. So John Adams pleaded with him in private conversation that if he could get that nobody else would vote against it, would he vote for it? New York was uncertain what the people of their colony wanted them to do, and they had previously stated that they would certainly vote no. One of Delaware's 3 delegates, Caesar Rodney, on July 1st, he was 80 miles away. The other 2 Delaware delegates were split in their votes. A messenger had been sent to find Caesar Rodney and to tell him that everything depended on his vote. He had to be there. Caesar Rodney, who had cancer, rode all night on horseback, 80 miles, in a horrible storm, so that he could be in Philadelphia to vote for independence. As you'll see in a moment, he entered the room just after the voting began. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania stuck to his convictions. He refused to vote for independence. But in private, in the middle of the night, John Adams requested, if you can't vote for independence, would you consider at least being absent tomorrow when the vote is taken? As they entered Independence Hall on July 2nd, 1776, no one knew if the vote would pass. And watch the look on all these men's faces as they each realize that this could actually happen. And when it's over, feel the quiet stillness as they try to comprehend what has just happened. It begins with John Hancock reading the resolution. The Declaration, of course, took the war to a whole new level, as this newly formed nation would now have to defend its bold decision against the mightiest army on earth. The Continental Army was greatly outnumbered, largely untrained, and they lacked provisions. Often, it looked like defeat was inevitable, but they never stopped praying, fighting, or believing in what they called the glorious cause. On October 19th, 1781, the British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia. The war officially ended 2 years later, in 1783, when Great Britain finally agreed to recognize the United States as a nation by signing the Treaty of Paris. I've asked Deacon Ken Silliman to lead us in our prayer for America this morning. And after he prays, then I'm going to ask that Shirley and my wife sing that song again. And while they're singing, could the are you going to have the orchestra? Okay. While they're singing, could the orchestra make their way to their instruments? And we're going to end the service by singing the Star Spangled Banner together. So, Brother Ken, please.